Okay, we're going to get started here. Thank you for joining us for the webinar. My name is Troy Baker. I'm the director of the Better Business Bureau Educational Foundation. I'd like to thank you for joining us. Just a couple things before we get going here. Some housekeeping. Everybody is on mute. The presentation is being recorded. We're going to take questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions, please type them into the question section on your panel. We will include them at the end of the presentation. We're going to send a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the video of this and some information that will be helpful to you as well. And if you have any issues right now, if you can't hear or you're not having a video connection, you might want to either check your Wi-Fi or hop out and then come back in. Oftentimes that will help improve your situation. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Phil Catlett, President and CEO of the Better Business Bureau Serving Western Michigan.
Thank you, Troy, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I know many business leaders are looking forward to this because it is so hard to understand what the coronavirus impact is going to be on our economy, and it's so difficult for businesses to invest and plan for the future. Should we be making cuts to live through a reduction in demand? Or should we adapt in order to thrive? Or should we be hiring to serve increased demand with the opening up of the economy? Just yesterday, Dr. Fauci was both optimistic and cautious about the course of COVID-19. He sounded quite positive about some vaccine tests reaching the final stages, and Fauci said he was hopeful that a coronavirus vaccine could be developed by early 2021. He also said that he has never seen a virus where 20 to 40% of those with the virus show no symptoms. There are estimates that 40% of coronavirus transmission is due to carriers not displaying symptoms of the illness. As a result, public health officials have advised people to keep a distance of 6 feet from one another, which sure makes doing business tough on a lot of us. The Upjohn Institute for Employment Research has been such a vital part of our community in providing regular updated economic forecasts and what it means for businesses in Michigan. Jim and his team have compiled what can businesses expect going forward in 2020. And so the BBB asked Jim Robey, PhD, Director of the Regional and Economic Planning Services at the W.E. Upjohn Institute, for forecasts to help us all make informed decisions about what is likely to happen to our economy for the rest of 2020 and in subsequent years. Jim, thank you for being here to share your findings.
Thanks, Phil and Troy, much appreciated. It's great to be with you all today. And as I get control of this, let's see. There we go. Sorry, I think I may have overshot this a little bit. So I'm with the, as Phil introduced me, I'm with the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. We are based in Kalamazoo for about the last 75 years. We are a group of academics and applied economists doing work across the footprint from the city of South Haven to Michigan Economic Development Corporation to the National Institute for Standards and Technology. As I talk today, the most important thing in looking at the mission of the Institute, which is to look at the causes and remedies for unemployment and employment, is to keep in mind that we're nonpartisan, and so we are not funded by any government or any interest group. And so anything that I say that sounds remotely political is entirely on me and not representative of the Institute. So it's interesting as we look at what's going on and trying to keep up to date on the current forecasts. March 5th, barely 3 months ago, I gave 2 Outlook talks in which we were looking at almost 64% labor force participation rate, unemployment rates of about 3.6%. And in my slides, the COVID-19 issue was one of those things down that may cause a recession, and we were really speculating that it was impacting supply chains as we saw in the Pacific Rim. Now fast forward to the 24th of June, and we see the forecast for the recovery is a moving target as Phil had suggested, as Dr. Fauci was both somewhat positive but also somewhat careful in looking forward. When we look at the recovery of the Michigan economy, the gray line, we see that early in 2012, the Michigan economy had recovered back to its pre-recession levels. By 2020, again, that March 5th day, we were 10% above where we were in employment in Michigan prior to the start of the recession. That fairly quickly caused us to fall off the cliff when our OEM auto manufacturers, our healthcare people, and others were ordered to stay at home and necessarily closed. And we see that Michigan took a much bigger hit as a share than the rest of the U.S. For that period. We are a state, of course, that continues to manufacture. And manufacturing had recovered, and there's a lot of arguments that the Great Recession was both cyclical and structural, and we saw that with the recovery of manufacturing in Michigan coming mid-2015. We had forecast in our work with the Right Place a slight decline in manufacturing, but overall relatively flat employment in this year and going into next year. And really what we saw again is just a huge hit as the auto manufacturers, the furniture manufacturers, and their supply chains were impacted by shutting down their production facilities. Looking at the service providing sector, again, this is both business services and personal services. We had seen a recovery in 2014, but again, everything just kind of fell off the cliff. The good news is from continuing claims, we've begun to see a return of people back to work and a reduction in continuing unemployment claims. But we also know that there are a lot of issues that the folks at the Unemployment Insurance Agency have been working through, including the potential hacking of some accounts by people offshore. So when we look at the West Michigan economy, we look at it, again, unemployment rates 90 to 120 days ago were in the 3.6 to 4% rates. And now we've estimated based on unemployment filings relative to employment in February of 2020 that the rates are between 17%. So 1 out of 5 workers is currently unemployed, and 1 out of 3 workers in some counties. Michigan's rate is about 1 in 4 workers, and that was the April 29th. Oh, sorry, that should be April 2020. Apologize for that. And so we are concerned about this. And you'll notice that I did not intentionally use the term lost jobs because I don't believe many of these jobs are lost. I think a lot of folks are out of work right now, but in looking at the WARN notices, the worker adjustment retraining notices that are filed for larger employers, we saw certainly during the early COVID days, many of them saying that these were temporary losses. We do have some concerns going forward, and I'll speak about that later, but I don't believe these are all lost jobs as it's often portrayed in the media, but rather they're jobs that are temporarily, workers that are temporarily displaced. The labor force participation rate continues in Kent County and Ottawa County to be very strong. This is the number of people 16 and over, the share that are either looking for work, so the unemployed, or are actually working, and we've seen significant decline in some of these areas to as low as in Mackinac County under 48%. So less than half the people that are eligible to be working are in fact in the job market and either looking for work or are working. So what we use a model. Sorry, as this catches up. We use a model from REMI, which is Regional Economic Models Incorporated, and we have the model for the entire state and a series of subregions. This is an economic forecasting model, and we use it to estimate economic impacts for projects and events. We estimate, again, for the Right Place and others forecasts and regional changes and trends. And so the data that you'll see is using a pre-COVID baseline of REMI, which is their model 2.3. And then we look at 3 updates for our REMI model, the most current one. And when we do this, the assumptions in REMI are that there are underlying national forecast trends. And then for each region, so for West Michigan, our regional forecast is updated. The things that affect those are expected growth or decline in series of industries. So there's a large industry mix effect to this. And I apologize for all the Spartans fans out there that we use the work of Gabe Ehrlich and his team at the University of Michigan, and we have used their forecast, and they've done interim forecast in March, April, and May, and you'll see the results of that and how it affects West Michigan. And also the Congressional Budget Office, we do see some data from them in these adjustments also. So our thanks to REMI for helping us with this component. And so when we look at, so a little baseline on Michigan in general, jobs were about 5.7 million pre-COVID. Output, which is the value of sales, essentially is just over $1 trillion. That's across all industries and across all sizes of firms, from small to medium to large firm. Personal income was about $500 million. I'm sorry, $503 billion. I apologize. In that for that year, for expected for 2020. What the initial thoughts are from the pre-COVID through May is that the economy has lost about 665,000 jobs. And again, I probably shouldn't use the term lost. It's really much more that many of those have been displaced workers that will likely return to work, but just under 12% of all positions in the state are currently not in place. Location quotients are essentially measures of how dense an industry is relative to the US, so it's a ratio. So if a location quotient is 1 for an industry, it means that the employment in that industry is about equal as a share to employment in that industry in the nation. When you get above 1, it's assumed to be an export industry, meaning it moves the goods and services out of the region, in this case, West Michigan. And also it shows that what you're really concentrated in. So for manufacturing, it's about 1.7. So we have about not quite twice as much share in manufacturing as the US, but in furniture, it's about 2% for Michigan. Motor vehicles, not surprisingly, 6 times the US share of employment. Machinery manufacturing, which is tied to motor vehicles and furniture, is 2.4, and just under 2 is fabricated metals. The reason I include these is it really shows what are the big things that are driving the Michigan economy. And again, manufacturing much more than much of the rest of the US. So when we look at total projected employment changes over the last 90 to 120 days, the gray line was the pre-COVID estimate. The dark blue line, the University of Michigan color is the March estimate. The revisions in the Carolina blue color were from April, and the most recent ones were from May. So when we were talking yesterday with Phil and Troy and I were speaking, Phil kind of said, do you think we'll ever get back to where we were, up to that gray line? And I do want to emphasize that the y-axis or the vertical axis is in no way to diminish this, is in large numbers of jobs. And so as we look at the out years 2029, and we have to be careful, and looking at that far out is how good are forecasts that far. It becomes probably a bit problematic, but by 2023, we're down about 400,000 jobs, holding all other things equal. But at the end, I'll talk about some things that may influence that. But we really do see a recovery and then kind of a return to about 5.5 million jobs in the state over time. We look at value added in Michigan, and we see that in value added is the component that labor adds to producing goods and services. So if you think about a $25,000 car and you have $15,000 worth of parts to go into it, that value added is about $10,000. That's where labor takes those parts, puts them together, and increases the value of those parts. Really, we see some decline from the pre-COVID to the current forecast, but we see most of the forecasts keeping value added right about where they were. So whether it's the March, April, or May, we continue to see growth in the economy, and I think this is important, but we do see somewhat lower values compared to pre-COVID times. The last one we'll look at in this is output per worker, and output is essentially the value of sales. And we see that the forecasts really don't change that much compared to pre-COVID to post-COVID. And one of the questions when we ran these estimates we asked Remy about was, why is May a little bit better? Well, as you remember from the last slide, we continue to see value added increasing, but we see employment decreasing. And so that relative measure, the output per worker, is likely going to increase, and likely also due to increased automation going forward. When we look at the West Michigan forecast, again, those same measures, just over 500,000 jobs pre-COVID, output of $92 billion, gross regional product, again, that value added of $46 billion. And personal income of just under $40 billion. And you'll see that the manufacturing location quotients are even higher in West Michigan. Again, West Michigan is a place that makes things. The manufacturing location quotient at 2.5 almost, machinery at 3, motor vehicles at 5.5, furniture at 6, not surprising there, in plastics and rubber. And so as we look at employers going back to work, these sorts of industries are really important to the recovery of the region, and not only from the standpoint of putting workers back in these industries, but also from supply chain aspects, and with that, the supply chain of households and others that provides goods and services to workers. And so this is all linked together. So even if we're talking about in many cases big businesses like Ford and Steelcase and others, it really is those workers spending money at restaurants and retail and other things that really affect the local economy. We do see significant declines in total employment over time. And so this is, again, pre-COVID versus the COVID period. But we do see flattening out, and maybe a little, because of the industry mix effect, a little bit of a less of a response than we saw maybe in Michigan with the initial pain of this COVID shift. Again, the projected value added in this is such that, you know, we are down, but compared to pre-COVID, but with both March and May forecasts paralleling upwards and kind of expecting some recovery there. Finally, output per worker in West Michigan. Again, we see that in the post-COVID environment where you have increasing output and increasing value added with fewer workers, we're going to get a better share of output per worker. That said, that's not necessarily ideal because we really want to get everybody back to work across the portfolio of workers at small, medium-sized, and large enterprises, as well as folks with varying arrays of skills. So moving forward, what are the things that we're looking at? Well, it's not clear what the shape of the recovery curve is. Clearly, it was a very quick downward slope, but we're not sure what it looks like coming back. I'm somewhat optimistic, and our friends at the University of Michigan are fairly optimistic. Other people are less so. And so when you saw the forecast that I presented earlier, likely more optimistic along with our folks at University of Michigan. We're unclear at this point about how supply and demand will play out. So supply is an issue because we continue to see Pacific Rim and Mexico with issues of supply chain, getting things onshore. And then on the demand side, how will people's demand change? Will people be willing to go to restaurants? Will people visit local retail? Will people use personal services? And how are people thinking about that? So while I'm fairly bullish on this, there are limitations to the supply side, as well as some questions on demand and people being willing to go out and to spend money and do things aside from online shopping. And so part of the concern I have, in going back to the WARN notices, is how the small and medium-sized enterprises will fare. And one thing we've seen recently is we've been watching WARN notices. These are the kind of major employer layoffs since the early part of January. And in that early part of January, they were mostly structural types of things. Companies were sold, workers were laid off, then rehired. Then we saw a whole series of COVID-related layoffs that were anticipated to be temporary. The thing that we're seeing now in late May and in June is some of these converting more to permanent, and that concerns me. And with the PPP program running out, how this is impacting particularly the SMEs is very concerning to me, because they provide a whole portfolio of jobs and services, whether tier 3 manufacturers, tier 2 manufacturers, or personal services like barbers and restaurants and other things. We don't know if there will be an impact of a second wave. We're seeing, of course, some increase in rates across the country, but that's to be expected as people interact more. But will that second wave be significant enough to force another shutdown of economies? Unknown at this point. One thing that I think is, and I want to be careful how I say this, is a bit of a bright spot is we believe, from talking with site selectors, corporate real estate people, and a review of the contemporary both business and industry literature, that reshoring is real. The issue of bringing supply chains into a more regional nature, and in this case, regional would be Canada, the US, and Mexico. And there are some questions with Mexico kind of being forced to reopen some of their plants and workers being resistant to that, that people will be doing strategic supply chain reshoring, bringing things onshore, and likely not just strategic goods like pharma, medical devices, but also those things that are essential to being produced, and when they can't easily be gotten offshore, due to transportation issues and other things. Finally, the other thing, two more things, how will technology impact employment? We're looking at many of the new plants coming online are looking at using more skilled workers with less employment, so we're not sure how people come back. We know that workers in West Michigan, or I'm sorry, firms in West Michigan were struggling trying to find workers prior to COVID-19 shutdowns, and we're putting things in place to help supplement the lack of workers and increase their productivity and output. So we don't know quite how that's going to work yet. And then the questions, of course, is when people have the opportunity to go back to work, will they? We've heard anecdotally that because people are getting this additional $600 through the end of July, they're somewhat reticent to go back to work because they may be making more on unemployment than they are in going back to work. Then there's this issue of fear of illness. So are people concerned about going back to work, particularly in industries where there's a lot of contact or close quarters? You know, we've seen tremendous numbers of plans for construction, manufacturing, restaurants, accommodations, and other things, but people still carry a lot of fear. And finally, what about the barriers to returning to work when kids aren't in school, particularly childcare issues, summer camps, and those sorts of things that people rely on? And that's really where we're uncertain is, you know, you take a large benefit, fear of illness, and then barriers to entry. How will people go back to work? Michigan's got sort of a mid approach to this. Other states like Ohio have taken a very strong look at sending people back to work and changing benefits if that doesn't happen. So kind of going back to a conversation with Phil, and then I'll close with Phil and Troy yesterday, is really, what gets us back to where we were. I think it's people going back to work. It's a lack of a second wave. Is the recovery curve relatively steep? Is demand strong? Are our firms able to come back, particularly our SMEs? And I think this reshoring thing, if we can find buildings and dirt in West Michigan for foreign direct investment and for domestic firms to bring back things, I think we can return to the very strong economy that we had before. But again, I tend to be somewhat optimistic, while many of my peers are not. So Phil and Troy and all of you, thanks for the opportunity, and I'll turn it back to Phil.
Jim, what a great presentation. We so much appreciate the clarity and very even-handed approach that you took to it. Before we get into some of the questions that are being submitted, I'd like to just ask you, how much does consumer confidence enter into all of this?
Well, that's a wonderful question. We've seen, so consumer confidence on March 5th was at one of the all-time highs, whether you're using the Conference Board or the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index. That, of course, took a huge tumble into the negative, over the last 3 months, but we've really seen consumers starting to come back, and 70% of the national economy is based in consumers. So if we get people willing to come back, and we've seen slightly slower retail home sales, but the numbers that came out for new home sales yesterday were far in advance of the consensus. And so, I personally know 3 people who have bought and sold homes during this process. So I think the consumer, particularly once they understand their financial viability, will come back.
So, Troy, are there some questions that have been submitted?
We don't have anything yet. I would invite anybody who has a question to go ahead and type it into the question section there. Jim, while we have you and we wait for that, one question I might have is, for anybody watching, you touched on this a little bit, but is there one thing that you would point to that gives you optimism that we're going to recover?
Yeah, so, again, if you go back to March 5th, the last time I gave too optimistic 128-month forecast of positive growth, is that the things that caused this to happen were not traditional reasons for a recession. And the recession was called, and then maybe it's over already, unlike the Great Recession, although this is much deeper, is that people, I'm trying to think of how to say this exactly, I think it really is that this wasn't caused by a slowing economy. There weren't tariffs, there weren't trade relations. It wasn't that the Eurozone was weak. It was that the whole world kind of shut down. And I think as it starts up, people are ready to go back to work in most places. And so I'm confident that, and I want to be careful how I say this, that this is a short-term thing, given the exuberance of the economy prior to this happening, which is much different than what was going on in, say, 2007, leading up to the beginning of 2008 with the recession.
Well, thank you. It doesn't look like we have any questions right now, so we'll go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank Jim and Phil for joining us, and Jim for his outlook here. We will be sharing this out to everybody who attended and those who weren't able to attend, and it will be on our Facebook page as well. And as always, you can find the Upjohn Institute, Jim's email is on there as well, and us at the Better Business Bureau at bbb.org. With that, I thank you for joining us and hope you have a great day.